Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Jinghong dual dynamic driver set. So this is a set that I think has actually been around for a little bit under a different name, or at least this is the 2022 upgraded version, which they didn't really talk about the upgrade, but I did get to see the graph of the old one, and it is slightly different. But there you go. So actually I said it is a dual dynamic driver. I think that's a 10mm and a 6mm. This one is an LCP. I don't think they specify what the smaller one is, but not too bad on the build quality. If we look closely, you can kind of see the crossover board is sitting right there as well. This is an MMCX connector, and I think they call this a natural stone faceplate, which I'm not sure that really is, but that's what they call it. So there you go. Build quality is actually quite nice. You do get two sets of tips with it, and they actually did a pretty good job of picking one small bore set, which is right here, and one wider bore set, which is here. So pretty good set for pretty good tip selection, nice little case, and a silver plated copper cable, which is actually pretty nice as well. So overall, not too bad for the price, which is about $29. The box is okay, not too much on there. But this is going to be the bulk of the review and probably the most important bits of it. And you can kind of see right away the signature, not a Harman style signature. It kind of has this big V shape. I call this the great arc shape. We'll talk about it in a second, but it's a shape that you run across occasionally. It's and I'll show you some other sets that do something similar, but I would call this signature not really a general purpose signature. It's more of a focused one. It is more of people who are seeking out this signature tend to enjoy it. Other people would probably find it, hit or miss with their playlists and preferences. But I do think once you hear it and like it, you get used to it. If you aren't used to hearing it, it's one of those things that it's at $29, maybe it's okay to try. But yeah, I think mostly it's for people who are really seeking out this style, this mid-bass heavy with a really big pinna gain. This is attractive to some people, some genres. I can't really figure out who those people are, but I would say that's what it is looks like. So when I say that there's sort of this great arc and other sets that use it, so this is sort of the great arc right here, and you end up with that rolled off sub bass with a big mid bass bump and GK10, the Geek World, so they're coming out the GK100 eventually. So that one was a pretty hyped up version of this style tuning. So big arc there, and then not so much pinna gain here, a more balanced version of this great arc tuning. NF Audio's NM2, so it doesn't really do the arc, so they have more of a linear bass right here, but then bumped it up just like the Jinghong set. So tons of pinna gain on the NM2, so that's sort of a different bass version with the same amount of focus right here. KZZEX did almost a more relaxed version of the same exact tuning, and again, this was a set that lots of people liked for certain genres, and I could never really figure out where the perfect match was. But again, you kind of get this mid-bass arc and then a more relaxed version of pinna gain here through extension. And then the Jinghong is in the blue, which is sort of the midway, but really bumped up there. So you can kind of see they gave it as much mid-bass as the other sets, but then really bumped it up to, that's nearly 15 decibels of pinna gain right there at 5K. That's going to be attractive to a limited number of people. So do keep that in mind, but I'll just kind of point it out that when you look at it in isolation, you're like, oh, that's just a big V or whatever you want to call it. Probably not for me, but then when you look at it in the context of other sets, it's not all that crazy. They just tended to bump this bit up a little more than other people do. So as I said, that's probably the most of it. We'll kind of walk through this really quickly. So the pros of this guy, I would say trending now, dual dynamic drivers is a hot topic right now. So I think in 2023, it was maybe a good marketing move to market a dual dynamic driver again. As I said, the built-in accessory is better than usual for that price. I think they did a pretty good job there. And focused tuning. And what I mean by that is you really get a focus here, and this is rolled off, and this is rolled off, and it tends to focus you right into the bulk of where the meat of most music lies. So, I think NF Audio, if we look at what they did, NF Audio tends to market towards professional musicians and producers, and they talk about this sort of focused approach where you're hearing the most important bits at levels that really draw your attention to it and for really critical listening. So while I think the Jinghong is a slight variation on that, I think the idea sort of stands in that you're listening to, it's really focusing your attention on a smaller range and doing that well as opposed to the rest of it. And the side effect of that, and we'll get to that in a second, I think is, it gives you a colored sound, and that's not for everyone, and it's not for some people and some genres, and maybe it works better on electronic. But I had the same criticism on NF Audio. Said I think it sounds good to some people. Maybe if you're just listening to instruments versus music, there is some attraction to that style of coloring that may not be for me, but I know people do enjoy it. And also, I think with the tuning, it just became a little harder to hear the advantages of dual dynamic drivers. As I said, other sets who were one dynamic driver did a very similar tuning, so it's a little harder to really hear the advantages of the dual dynamic drivers here. Sound tweaks, smaller tips will leak some bass. So actually these foam tips, if they're a little bit smaller for your ears, they will leak bass a bit, and you end up with a more neutral, bright presentation. That might be good, might be bad. It's kind of an interesting approach. When the first time I tried the foam tips, I'm like, wow, this thing seems really bright. But then you sort of figure out that it's just not sealing property, and you end up with a lot of bass leak. So, you can kind of think about it more of if you drop this back down to like in a level over here, you end up with a very neutral style bass and then bright. So it actually, you accidentally come up with a neutral bright set that was unintentional. And then micropore tape on the nozzle will reduce and relax that treble intensity. So that looks like this guy. So same signature, but the red is actually just a little piece of micropore tape, which looks like this. So when I put micropore tape on the nozzle, I tend to try to leave space around it so sound goes unfiltered through it. So if you look closely, you can kind of see that some of the holes are covered. Most of the holes are covered, but some are not. If you cover all of them, it ends up with a much darker, bassier sound, but cover some of them, and you end up with sort of a nice range where you can actually tweak these values here. So the blue is the stock, and the red is what happens after you put micropore down. You can kind of see it just gives you a more balanced version. I would call this maybe a more westernized version of this tuning, but bringing this down to just over 10 dB is a little bit or much easier on my ears than the original stock tuning. So those are some tweaks that you can do on that guy. Sound, like I said, it's got that kind of V shape, bass and treble. It sounds like an EDM track. Maybe Avicii Levels is one that actually played pretty well on it. I think it does work for electronic music. Bass, mid bass, right? It's got the big hump there, rolls off on the sub bass. Does pop music in kind of a fun, thumpy, thick way because it's got so much mid bass and not a whole lot of rumble in the back end. I think thumpy, punchy I think all of the things kind of apply to this style bass. Mids, obviously not a mid-centric set, and that coloring. So I said it works better in electronic tracks. It tends to work better in tracks where you don't know whether it sounds colored or not, and I think electronic falls in that category. I think that's why people rely on electronic sometimes in reviews. It's like the voices are kind of skewed in a way that is not natural, but electronic, it's always kind of harder to hear whether that becomes a lot less noticeable. But kind of fun. Treble boosted to cover that bass, right? You've got a ton between 2 and 5. That is a lot of energy, and energy carries through all the way over here. It's just a lot here, and then it rolls off pretty hard there. And again, I would say that that's just really a focus thing of they were really, really trying to focus your attention on that bit, the meat of tracks, and I think that's why they do it. And I think ironically, I think the early roll-off actually works in the upper treble to just keep it cleaner and focused and perhaps in the zone of the driver. perhaps that's where that driver tended to work best. I think that was pretty intentional, and I think it, ironically, I think it works. But anyway, stage just enough height to create a more open sound, more separation imaging than I thought there was going to be, and I think rolling both sides, again, it helps reduce the clutter. I think all those things that would have clouded up the sound stage and made it, a little less clear on the imaging, I think just rolling those off, I think actually worked out pretty well here. So some interesting choices, interesting signature. I don't know. It's a hard one to convince people to purchase because of the signature, but it's interesting. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.